The certified letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and Marcus Webb, 43, a real estate attorney specializing in property law, felt his jaw tighten as he read the words printed in bold. Final notice, $2,500 in accumulated fines for unauthorized street parking. Payment due within 72 hours or legal action will commence. For 8 weeks, Linda Castellano, the newly elected HOA president, had been leaving bright orange violation notices on his truck. 8 weeks of condescending. Notes about community standards and property values. What Linda didn't know was that Marcus had spent the last 6 years quietly purchasing historical property records for his entire neighborhood, and 3 months ago, he'd made a discovery that would change everything. The street she kept citing him for parking on, according to a deed from 1887, Marcus didn't just have the right to park there. He owned it. Every single inch. Tonight, everything was about to change. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story of justice served, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of karma and revenge. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a good person too far, the confrontation where power shifted completely, and the resolution where justice was finally served in the most satisfying way imaginable. The first part takes us through Marcus's growing nightmare as a power-hungry HOA president targeted him relentlessly. Every morning brought a new violation notice, each fine larger than the last. His attempts to reason with Linda were met with mockery and threats. Calls to the HOA board went nowhere because Linda had stacked it with her friends. His neighbors watched in silence as he was humiliated at community meetings, accused of being a troublemaker who refused to follow simple rules. The harassment escalated until it wasn't just about parking anymore. It became about control, about one person's need to dominate another. And through it all, Marcus endured, documented, and quietly researched. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't hot or cold. It's researched, verified, and legally bulletproof. The second part reveals the moment Marcus stopped defending himself and started dismantling Linda's authority piece by piece. At an emergency HOA meeting she called to discuss his continued violations, Marcus arrived with a leather portfolio that would shatter her carefully constructed power structure. The revelation of what he discovered sent shockwaves through the room. Linda's face drained of color as Marcus laid out documentation that proved she'd been enforcing rules she had no legal authority to create. The room watched as the balance of power didn't just shift, it inverted completely. The third part shows the beautiful unraveling of Linda's manufactured authority and the restoration of something more valuable than revenge, truth. Because sometimes justice isn't about destroying your enemy. It's about exposing the lie they built their power on. Here's exactly how it happened. Marcus Webb had worked his entire adult life for the home at 847 Oakmont Drive. At 43, he'd finally achieved what his parents, immigrants who cleaned office buildings to put him through college, dreamed about. A real estate law practice successful enough to afford a house in Riverside Meadows, one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods. The 1920s craftsman had cost him 15 years of 80-hour weeks, missed vacations, and countless sacrifices. He bought it 3 years ago, and every morning when he pulled into his driveway after his 6 a.m. runs, he felt that quiet pride of knowing he'd earned every square foot. Marcus specialized in property, law, and historical deed research, the kind of tedious work that required patience and precision. His firm helped developers navigate complex title issues, and he'd become known as the attorney who could untangle property disputes that had dragged on for decades. It was detail-oriented work that most lawyers found boring, but Marcus loved the puzzle of it tracing ownership back through generations, finding the single document that changed everything. His home office was filled with leather-bound property records and historical maps he collected over the years. What started as professional necessity had become a genuine hobby. The trouble began in late September, when Linda Castellano won the HOA presidency by a margin of 3 votes and an N. Election where only 8 of the community's 67 homeowners bothered to participate. Linda, 56, ran a luxury home staging business and recently divorced after her husband left her for a younger colleague. Within her first week as president, she'd sent 14 violation notices to various homeowners for infractions, ranging from slightly overgrown hedges to mailboxes painted the wrong shade of approved colors. Marcus noticed but didn't think much of it. He kept his property immaculate, his lawn professionally maintained, his home's exterior freshly painted in historically accurate colors. He had nothing to worry about. The first notice appeared on his windshield on October 3rd, a Tuesday morning. Orange paper, printed in aggressive bold font. Violation: unauthorized overnight street parking. Fine: $100. Future violations will result in escalating penalties. Marcus stared at his truck, parked exactly where he parked it for 3 years, on the public street in front of his house. He checked the HOA bylaws that night. Nothing prohibited street parking. Nothing even mentioned it. He emailed Linda a polite inquiry, citing the specific bylaw sections, and asked for clarification. Her response came within an hour. The street parking prohibition is covered under Section 7.3, Community Aesthetic Standards. Your truck is an eyesore that diminishes property values. Pay the fine or face additional penalties. Marcus read Section 7.3. It mentioned nothing about parking. It addressed lawn maintenance and exterior paint colors. He called her directly. She didn't answer. He left a voicemail explaining the bylaw didn't support her claim. 2 days later, another notice, $250 this time. Second violation: continued disregard for community standards. Marcus drove to Linda's house that evening, knocked on her door, and when she answered, he calmly explained there was no parking prohibition in the bylaws. Linda looked at him with barely concealed contempt and said, "I don't care what the old bylaws say. I'm updating them to reflect proper standards. Pay your fines, Mr. Webb, or I'll make your life in this neighborhood very uncomfortable." She closed the door in his face. He stood there for a moment, stunned by her casual dismissal, then walked back to his truck with a neighbor's curtain shifting quickly closed in his peripheral vision. The next Monday, he attended the HOA board meeting. Linda had appointed 3 friends to fill vacant board positions, none of whom had run for election. When Marcus raised his concern about the parking fines during the open comment period, Linda cut him off after 30 seconds. "Your time is up. The board has reviewed your case and finds the violations valid." Next agenda item. 2 board members wouldn't even look at him. The third, Carol Reeves, actually smirked. The violations continued. Every week, another notice. $350, $500, $750. The amounts climbed according to what Linda called escalating penalty structures. Marcus documented everything, photographed each notice, saved every email, recorded dates and times. He called the police, but they said it was a civil HOA matter. He contacted 3 board members directly. None returned his calls. He tried reasoning with Linda at another community meeting in November. She interrupted him, suggested he should consider moving if he couldn't follow simple rules, and said his attitude was exactly why the community needed stronger enforcement. 15 neighbors watched it happen. Not one spoke up. By mid-November, Marcus had received notices totaling $2,500. His truck, a reliable Ford F-150 he'd owned for 8 years, was apparently destroying property values. His parking on a public street was an unforgivable aesthetic crime. And Linda Castellano had decided she had the authority to collect thousands in fines for violations that didn't exist. That's when Marcus stopped trying to reason with her and started doing what he did best: research. Because Marcus Webb didn't just specialize in property law. He specialized in historical property records. And over the next 3 weeks, working late into the night after the rest of his family had gone to sleep, Marcus discovered something extraordinary. The street Linda kept citing him for parking on wasn't actually owned by the city or the HOA, according to a deed recorded in 1887. When Oakmont Drive was first developed, the original landowner had retained ownership of the road right-of-way as a private easement. That ownership had passed through several hands over 138 years, and through a series of estate sales and quiet title actions, Marcus traced the chain of ownership forward. Decade by decade, document by document, the current owner, according to Multnomah County records updated just 14 months ago, Marcus Webb, when he purchased his home, the title included a historical easement he barely glanced at in the 1,000-page closing documents. But now, reading it carefully with fresh eyes, he understood exactly what he owned. He owned Oakmont Drive, the entire 300-foot section in front of the 8 houses on his block. Not just an easement to use it, actual ownership of the underlying land. The city maintained it as a courtesy, but legally, it was private property. Marcus stayed up until 3 a.m. that night, verifying every document, checking every reference, confirming the chain of title was unbroken and legally sound. By sunrise, he was certain he owned the street. And Linda Castellano had spent 2 months collecting illegal fines, issuing fraudulent violations, and harassing him for parking on his own property. If they wanted to play games, Marcus would show them what games really looked like played by someone who knew all the rules and happened to own the board. And on December 4th, exactly 8 weeks after that first violation notice, when Linda called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss escalating enforcement actions against him, everything was finally ready. Marcus had the evidence, the deed, the historical records, the legal authority, and most importantly, the resolve to see this through to the very end. The emergency meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on December 4th, a Wednesday evening with rain hammering against the community center windows. Linda had sent the agenda that morning. Discussion of continued covenant violations by resident at 847 Oakmont Drive. Vote to authorize. Legal action to collect outstanding fines and potential lien placement on property. Marcus arrived at 6:55 p.m. carrying a worn leather portfolio and a cardboard document tube. He took a seat in the front row, directly facing the folding table, where Linda sat between her 3 appointed board members. 22 neighbors filled the remaining chairs, the largest attendance Marcus had seen at any HOA meeting. Word had spread that something significant was happening tonight. Linda started the meeting at 7:02 p.m. without preamble. We're here to address a resident who has accumulated $2,500 in violations and has refused to comply with community standards. Despite numerous warnings, Mr. Webb has shown a pattern of disregard for HOA authority that we simply cannot tolerate. She glanced at Marcus with barely concealed satisfaction. The board has prepared a motion to authorize our attorney to file a lien against the property at 847 Oakmont Drive and pursue legal collection of these fines. Does anyone have questions before we vote? Marcus raised his hand. Linda's eyes narrowed. Mr. Webb, you'll have an opportunity to speak after the vote. Actually, Marcus said calmly, standing, I'd like to speak before you vote. Since this meeting is specifically about my alleged violations, I believe I'm entitled to present evidence in my defense. His voice was measured, professional, the same tone he used in courtrooms. Linda opened her mouth to object, but Carol Reeves touched her arm and whispered something. Linda's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. 5 minutes. That's all. Marcus walked to the front of the room and set the portfolio on the table. I've received 17 violation notices over the past 8 weeks. Every single one cites unauthorized street parking on Oakmont Drive. He pulled out a folder containing copies of every notice Linda had issued. I've been fined $2,500 total for parking my truck on what you've called a public street in violation of HOA community aesthetics standards. He looked directly at Linda. Is That an accurate summary? It is, Linda said flatly. And you've refused to pay or comply. I've refused because the violations are fraudulent, Marcus replied. He opened the portfolio and pulled out a document sealed in plastic. I'd like to submit into the record a certified copy of a property deed recorded with Multnomah County on March 15th, 1887. This deed conveyed ownership of a parcel from the Oregon Land Company to Harrison Webb, my great-great-grandfather. He handed copies to each board member. The parcel description, as surveyed at the time, includes not just the residential lot that would eventually become 847 Oakmont Drive, but also the road right-of-way that would become Oakmont Drive itself, specifically the 300-foot section between Maple Street and Birch Avenue. The room had gone completely silent. Linda was staring at the document, her face slowly losing color. Marcus continued in the same calm, measured tone. Property ownership rights in Oregon operate under a doctrine called adverse possession, but only when actual possession and control are exercised. In this case, the road right-of-way was maintained by the city under an informal arrangement, but legal ownership never transferred. I've traced a chain of title through 138 years. Harrison Webb passed the property to his son Robert. In 1923, Robert subdivided the residential lots in 1946, but retained ownership of the road easement. It passed through 3 more generations, including my grandfather, my father, and finally to me when I purchased 847 Oakmont Drive in 2022. He pulled out another document. This is the title insurance commitment for my home purchase, which specifically lists the road easement as an included asset. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time. It seemed like an archaic legal technicality. But over the past 3 weeks, I've had a surveyor confirm the boundaries, had my title insurance company verify the chain of ownership, and had 2 independent real estate attorneys review the documentation. He placed copies of all these documents on the table. Oakmont Drive from Maple to Birch is private property. My private property. Not city property. Not HOA property. Mine. Linda's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Carol Reeves was reading the deed with growing alarm. Marcus turned to address the full room, which means that every violation notice Linda has issued, every fine she's collected from me, has been based on her assertion of authority over property she doesn't control and has no jurisdiction over. I haven't been parking on HOA property or public streets. I've been parking on my own private road. He turned back to Linda. You've spent 8 weeks harassing me, insulting me, threatening to place a lien on my home, and collecting $2,500 in fines that have no legal basis whatsoever. You've done this while claiming authority you don't have, citing bylaws that don't exist, and ignoring every attempt I made to resolve this reasonably. His voice remained level but gained steel. I'm a property law attorney. Linda, I've spent my entire career dealing with people who think they can bully their way through legal disputes. And I've learned that the best way to deal with bullies is documentation, patience, and an airtight legal case. Linda found her voice. This is ridiculous. You can't own a public street. The city maintains it. Cars drive on it every day. The city maintains it under what's called a permissive use arrangement, which I'm happy to continue allowing, Marcus said. But maintenance doesn't equal ownership. The deed is clear, the survey confirms it, and the title is undisputed. I own that street. He pulled out yet another document. And since you've been issuing fines and threatening legal action based on fraudulent authority, I've prepared a formal complaint to file with the Oregon Department of Justice concerning HOA misconduct. I've also drafted a civil lawsuit for harassment and abuse of process, seeking return of the $2,500 you've illegally collected, plus damages for emotional distress and legal fees. The room erupted. Neighbors turned to each other, voices rising. One man shouted, "She fined me $600 for a basketball hoop." Another woman stood up. "She threatened to leave my house for wind chimes." Linda banged her gavel uselessly, her face now red with anger and embarrassment. Carol Reeves was urgently whispering to the board member next to her. Marcus waited for the noise to settle. "I'm not interested in destroying anyone," Marcus said quietly, and the room gradually quieted to hear him. "I'm interested in justice. So here's what's going to happen. Linda, you're going to resign as HOA president, effective immediately. The board is going to rescind every fine you've issued to me. You're going to send a written apology to every homeowner you've harassed with fraudulent violations. And you're going to refund every penny you've collected under false pretenses." He paused. "If you do those things, I won't file the state complaint or the civil lawsuit. If you refuse, I'll proceed with both, and I'll also notify every homeowner in this community that they have grounds to sue for any fines they paid under your manufactured enforcement regime." Linda's hands were shaking. "You can't force me to resign." "You're right, I can't," Marcus agreed. "But I can make your life very uncomfortable if you don't. I can file a formal complaint with the state that will trigger an investigation into every fine you've issued, every meeting you've held, every decision you've made. I can subpoena all HOA records and audit every penny of community funds you've controlled. I can depose you under oath about your understanding of HOA authority and property law." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm a real estate attorney, Linda. This is literally what I do for a living. I have the time, the expertise, and the motivation to pursue this as far as it needs to go. Or you can resign tonight, apologize, and make this right. Your choice. You have 60 seconds to decide." The room was absolutely silent. All eyes were on Linda. Her face had gone from red to pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Perel Reeves whispered urgently, "Linda, just do it. This is bad." The other board members were nodding. Finally, Linda's shoulders sagged. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I resign." Marcus nodded once. "I'll need that in writing, along with the apology letter and refund checks, delivered to my home by Friday at 5 p.m. If I don't receive them, I file the complaints Monday morning." "Understood?" Linda nodded without speaking, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. Marcus gathered his documents, placed them back in the portfolio, and walked toward the door. As he passed his neighbors, several reached out to touch his arm, murmuring thanks. Marcus watched them disappear into the rainy night, then pulled out his phone and sent a single text to his wife. "It's done. She resigned. We won." And for the first time in 8 weeks, Marcus Webb smiled. Friday afternoon arrived with week. December sunshine breaking through Portland's typical cloud cover. Marcus sat in his home office at 4:30 p.m., checking email while periodically glancing at his front door. At 4:47 p.m., his doorbell rang. Through the window, he could see Linda Castellano standing on his porch, alone, holding a manila envelope. He took his time walking to the door, letting her wait just long enough to be uncomfortable, then opened it. "Mr. Webb," Linda said stiffly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair less perfectly styled than usual. "I have the documents you requested." She held out the envelope. Marcus took it without inviting her inside. He opened it while she stood there and methodically reviewed the contents. A typed resignation letter on HOA letterhead, dated December 4th and signed by Linda Castellano. A separate letter addressed to all homeowners who received violations during her tenure, apologizing for overzealous enforcement and announcing that all fines were rescinded. And finally, a cashier's check for $2,500 made out to Marcus Webb. "The board is mailing copies of the apology letter to affected homeowners on Monday," Linda said quietly. "And I've already stepped down. Carol Reeves is acting president until the next election." She paused, seeming to struggle with the next words. "I want you to know that I genuinely believed I was improving the neighborhood. I thought stricter standards would increase property values." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Linda, I don't doubt you believe that. But you went about it by manufacturing authority you didn't have and targeting people who couldn't fight back. You used your position to bully your neighbors into compliance with rules you invented. He folded the document and held up the check. This isn't about parking violations or property values. It's about you deciding you had the power to make people's lives miserable because no one challenged you. He softened his voice slightly. I hope you learned something from this. Power without accountability always ends badly. Linda's jaw tightened, but she nodded once and turned away without another word. Marcus watched her walk to her car, climb in, and drive away. Then he closed the door, walked to his office, and deposited the check using his phone. The money hit his account within seconds. Over the following 3 months, Riverside Meadows underwent a quiet transformation. Carol Reeves, the interim president, immediately suspended all pending violations and called a community-wide meeting to review the actual HOA bylaws. It turned out Linda had issued 47 violation notices during her 2-month presidency, collecting over $12,000 in fines. Under Carol's leadership, the board refunded every penny and implemented new procedures requiring any fine to be reviewed by at least 2 board members and grounded in specific written bylaw provisions. Marcus received an apology from the Johnsons at 839 Oakmont, who'd been fined $600 for having their RV parked in their driveway. They paid it immediately, intimidated by Linda's threats, and were overjoyed to receive a full refund. The Parkers, at 851, Oakmont stopped by with a bottle of wine to thank Marcus for standing up to Linda when no one else would. She fined us $400 for having garden gnomes that were aesthetically inconsistent, Mrs. Parker explained. We took them down because we couldn't afford to fight her. Now they're back in our garden where they belong. Marcus discovered that Linda had left the neighborhood entirely. She'd sold her home in January and moved to Vancouver, Washington. One neighbor mentioned seeing her LinkedIn profile had been updated. She closed her staging business and taken a job as a retail associate at a furniture store. Whether this represented genuine humility or simple economic necessity, Marcus didn't know and didn't particularly care. He'd never wanted to destroy Linda. He just wanted her to stop. The most gratifying outcome came in February when the HOA held its first properly noticed election in years. 18 homeowners ran for 5 board positions, and 53 of the 67 homeowners voted, the highest turnout in the community's history. Carol Reeves won the presidency by a landslide. At her first official meeting, she presented Marcus with a framed resolution thanking him for defending property rights and ensuring HOA accountability. Marcus accepted it graciously and hung it in his office, not out of pride, but as a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing requires patience, documentation, and willingness to stand alone until others find the courage to stand with you. On a warm evening in early March, Marcus sat on his front porch with his wife Elena, watching their 2 daughters chalk drawing on the driveway. His truck was parked exactly where it had always been, on Oakmont Drive, without a single orange violation notice in sight. The neighborhood was peaceful. The street lights flickered on as dusk settled. Marcus sipped his coffee and thought about the 8 weeks of harassment, the countless hours spent researching dusty property records, the confrontation that could have gone very differently if he hadn't been absolutely certain of his legal position. Do you regret how you handled it? Elena asked quietly. She'd watched the whole ordeal unfold, supporting him, but also worried about the stress it caused. Marcus considered the question carefully. I regret that it was necessary, he said finally. I regret that Linda thought bullying people was an acceptable way to exercise authority. I regret that so many neighbors suffered before someone finally pushed back. But do I regret standing up for myself? Not for a second. Elena smiled and took his hand. You know what the best part is. You didn't just win. You changed things for everyone. Marcus nodded slowly. That was true. Linda's reign had been short but damaging, and it had taken one person armed with the right knowledge, the right documentation, and the refusal to be intimidated to end it. But the real victory wasn't personal. It was systemic. The HOA now operated with transparency and accountability. Neighbors felt empowered to question authority instead of automatically complying. And the community had learned that challenging injustice doesn't make you a troublemaker. It makes you responsible. As darkness settled fully over Riverside Meadows, and his daughters packed up their chalk to head inside, Marcus looked down at the street history and felt a satisfaction that went deeper than vindication. He'd learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom or a badge. Sometimes it comes from refusing to be a victim, from documenting everything, and from knowing exactly when to stop asking for help and start demanding respect. And as Marcus sat there in the peace he'd fought for, watching the evening stars emerge over Portland's skyline, he smiled. Not with bitterness or vindication, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows they did everything right, even when doing it the hard way. Because justice, whether served hot or cold, swift or slow, is equally satisfying when you serve it yourself. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply insisting on the truth. Across the country in Charleston, South Carolina, 47-year-old former IRS senior auditor Diane Morrison was planting roses in her front garden when her neighbor, entitled real estate developer Clayton Pierce, marched across her lawn demanding she remove the roses immediately because they violated the verbal neighborhood agreement about flowering plants. Clayton didn't know that Diane wasn't just any retiree. She was the former head of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, who'd spent 22 years taking down tax fraud schemes. When Clayton threatened to report her to code enforcement and make her life difficult, Diane smiled, the same calm, calculating smile that once preceded fraud prosecutions, and asked, "How long have you been claiming this development property as your primary residence for the tax exemption, Clayton?" His face went pale. "Because I have some friends at the local assessor's office who'd be very interested in your actual residence in Miami. But that's a story for another time."